The restaurant The French Laundry is getting sued for wage theft, as well as a new hospitality concierge platform from an unexpected player in the space. This is the Repertoire Report on the Repertoire podcast. My name is Justin Khanna. I'm here with Ray DeLucci. How are you, man? We got a bunch of stories today.
Doing good. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I was not expecting this Los Angeles Times piece on the French Laundry. This is a kind of, I saw the headline, read the article, kind of thought it was a little bit of a nothing burger, and then you and I were discussing the maybe broader implications for something like this. I know you took a bunch of notes. Maybe you can kick us off with this story, because I know you did a little bit of a deep dive, and then I want to comment as well, having worked there myself. So go ahead.
Yes. So I'll set the stage. So LA Times reports, quote, the French Laundry, the 3 Michelin-starred restaurant helmed by renowned chef Thomas Keller, has been sued by a former employee who alleges wage theft and other labor law violations at the Yountville, California eatery. The suit, brought by Elena Flores Bateta, a dishwasher at the restaurant for 3 years beginning in 2022, alleges that the French Laundry Restaurant Corporation and the Thomas Keller Restaurant Group violated labor laws by failing to pay minimum wage or overtime hours, as well as neglecting to provide mandated rest breaks or access to proper resting facilities or break rooms. Quote, plaintiff was required to work off the clock, work through meal and rest periods without compensation, received pay stubs that failed to accurately reflect her hours and premium wages, and was not paid final wages upon separation, says the complaint. Go on to say that a spokesperson for the restaurant said that the allegations in the suit are the first such claims to be made in the restaurant's 48-year history, that they are based on inaccurate, baseless information, and that the suit is a frivolous attention-seeking filing. The suit describes supervisors allegedly sending Batista and her coworkers back to their workstations 3 to 4 times per week to finish cleaning after they had already clocked out for the day. This additional cleaning of walls, mopping of floors, and removing accumulated food waste from the dishwasher typically took 5 to 10 minutes, and workers were not allowed to clock back in to record the unpaid time. They also allege that the meal breaks were frequently interrupted when the supervisor would go back to clean buckets or dispose of trash. The suit was filed as a representative action on behalf of Bateta, as well as an estimated 50 potential current and former employees, through a unique California law called the Private Attorneys General Act, or PAGA, which grants workers the ability to sue employers on behalf of themselves, other employees, and the state of California over workplace violations. It's important to note that in 2024, the law was reformed through a legislative deal after a pressure campaign by business groups who said the law was being exploited for cash grabs by predatory attorneys. The reforms made it more difficult to simply demand a hefty payout from a company if companies can show they are trying to correct a violation by giving back to pay to workers and agreeing to change the offending practices. The law keeps penalties low. And then lastly, workers represented by private attorneys are limited to seeking penalties only for labor code violations they personally experienced. Nonprofit legal organizations have more leeway to pursue penalties for other allegations employees experienced, even if the individual worker named in the lawsuit did not personally experience all of them. So, Justin, I'll get your initial reaction. I have some thoughts as well, but just your reaction on this initially.
Yeah, I wanted to throw out a couple more numbers that I saw from the lawsuit or the article here. The attorney is seeking $35,000 in damages, civil penalties, and attorney fees. And so that's just kind of the scale and scope of what we're looking at here. I know we're going to get into the nitty-gritty and the broader implications of this. I did not experience this working at the French Laundry. I've experienced other situations that rhyme with this at other restaurants that I've worked at. And I know that you have as well, Ray, where whether it's coming in a little bit early, staying a little bit after. I know that I've certainly had managers that are super on the what time frame needs to be clocked in versus clocked out. I've had instances where you come into prep for several minutes, even going into a couple of hours, and then it's like, okay, when we've hit this time on the clock, everybody has to go over to the screen and clock in, even though some of us have been there for extended periods of time. And that is more or less to address maybe some comments that folks might have where that's currently happening at my workplace right now. This happened to me in the past and nothing ever came of it. I never wanted to quote unquote sue my employer because of this. But I think you and I are much more interested in, as we're modernizing the industry, as the tech tools are getting better, as we're having different swaths and generations and attitudes of people joining hospitality as a whole, how can we take a look at this thing that people are acknowledging is a problem? I was pulling up the California labor laws to just cross-check what was happening in this article to literally what was the lawmakers are putting into law. And if it's not matching, I would be almost like intellectually dishonest to take a look at something like that being in place. And then this is not about being, trying to go after these employers or trying to tear businesses down. I'm more trying to say, if there's something that is off from a compliance perspective, if you're not going to apply the same standards across sanitation, across the way that you're filing taxes, across, insert your thing, I just think it's maybe a little bit irresponsible, and it sets a bad precedent for applying standards going forward. So I'll let you continue, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, I think a couple of important things to note is this idea of compliance of how restaurants have operated. I've also worked in restaurants where, my scheduled shift is from 9 to we'll say of course not 9 to 5 if you work in a restaurant, but let's just say 9 to 5. But I'm in at 8:30 prepping because I have a lot of prep where I was behind. This idea that you're not being paid for the work because you're quote unquote behind, like that is going to go away. And I think the implications of the lawsuit is if that happens, you're going to see a lot of restaurants pivot away from that. I don't agree with that practice. I think you should be paid for your work. And if you're staying before, you're staying after, late, like you should be paid for that. And I do think a lot of restaurants exist in this realm of you're going to be pressured into, and I'm not saying this is the case with the French Laundry, but I will say I've worked in restaurants where I was pressured to come in early to get my stuff done, not on the clock because I was, maybe behind or like whatever the excuse was. And I will say this, like out of the lawsuit, the one like maybe critique I have of the French Laundry is if the allegations are true of like lunch being disrupted or whatnot. Like that's fair. Like that is fair. Like you have to you do need to follow those labor laws, especially if you're a premier business like the French Laundry. What I will say, maybe not in defense of French Laundry, but just restaurants have operated in such a way for so long, thinking they're compliant, having this, off the clock type maybe behavior. And so I do think it's important for restaurants to take note and to function differently. And do I think that the French Laundry was maliciously going after stealing this person's wages? I don't necessarily believe that. I do think they were operating though in a way that maybe isn't attuned to where we should be as an industry, where people should be getting paid for their full time. And I can guarantee that most everyone here listening to this podcast has worked off the clock in a restaurant. And like, I don't know that that entails every single restaurant that's ever been, doing that is sued per se, but this lawsuit will enact that action where you cannot violate that. And for that, I do think it could, if it does go through and it's ruled in their favor, it could be a positive for the industry. But it is interesting to see. So
There's a couple of other data points that I wanted to bring up because it didn't ring a bell. It almost made me think of other instances where this restaurant group has been not tiptoeing, but being very mindful of where labor laws are at and wanting to play by the rules. And so I recall during my time as an extranet per se, and then I ended up going to be a chef de partie at the French Laundry, I was always kind of confused because this was at the peak staging time. This was 2013, 2011 to 2015, that kind of season. And specifically, there was a bunch of lawsuits that were coming out around other businesses. The sources I found said like between 1.1 and 1.4 million dollars across the industry, across these big players. And the French Laundry basically decided no more unpaid stages. This is not something where you can email us and send your resume and offer to come out for a month or offer to, spend time here for a week or 3 months. That's not happening. My experience was I went there for a working interview, basically where I spent time in the kitchen because I had a relationship with one of the chefs there, and that was the opportunity. And he quite honestly told me at the end of the experience, he was like, I just needed to have you come. I was going to give you the role. I basically needed to just tick the box that we did a working interview with you. And that was just kind of a weird thing to experience sitting across the table from this person. But they were almost ahead of this in a world where you and I are covering these stories of 2016, 2017, 2018 restaurants, like Noma, not to bring up that story in this episode. I know that we want to maybe not focus on Noma in this episode, but they were increasing almost their number of stages they were having. And so that's also something that I wanted to touch on, is that they're wanting to play by the rules here. They're wanting to make sure that their things are buttoned up. And so that's why I think that their response, calling it baseless, calling it frivolous, those types of quotes here, it's not necessarily wanting to discount the people who are having these charges, but I think TKRG as an organization has a lot of stuff buttoned up here, and they are not the organization where there's a bunch of people who are it's an unpaid army behind the scenes doing some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So I appreciate you calling that out. I also want to call out that as an employee on the kitchen side, I don't have any experience on the front of house side. I don't have any experience on the dishwasher side. I don't have any experience on the admin side. But, and those are all different, verticals and departments, if you want to call it that, of the organization. We would have staff meal and it would be like a dedicated break. We would go out in the
Yeah.
garden and eat. You would, sit at a table out in the courtyard. There was a bunch of different ways that you would, decide that you were going to take that break. The way that the California Labor Department has the laws set is that you are entitled to one net 10-minute paid rest break for every 4 hours worked. And the reason I'm saying that, just to bring everybody up to speed, is I know we have some international listeners. I know that we have people who are thinking about, okay, well, what are these rules of the road that I need to play by as I'm setting up my business? You need to be aware of these things as you're setting some of this stuff up for yourself. And then from a timing perspective, great breaks must, as much as is practicable, be taken in the middle of each work period. So it's not something where you can just stack everything towards the end and just say, okay, you can get off 20 minutes early and consider that part of your break. It needs to be a break in the context of working. And then the last piece that this lawsuit is kind of touching on, breaks must be completely uninterrupted. Employers cannot require you to remain on call, carry a radio, or perform any tasks. And then this is important. If a break is interrupted, the 10-minute clock must legally restart. And so that, I think, is the thing that this person is touching on, is you're on your break, you're eating your lunch, you're doing whatever it is on this time that this employer is required to give you, and you get that, reach around the corner, say, hey, I need you to do XYZ thing. From a legal perspective, that break technically needs to restart. And I don't know if it's, again, we can come up with stories until the cows come home here could this person have just said something like, I will do that after my break? Should that have been required by that employee? You know what I mean? Like, all of this being understood by all parties involved all the way down the stack, I think, is the reason why we're trying to cover this today. Not because we want to pile on or say that XYZ person is entitled or we're taking maybe one side over another. It's more, if we want the industry to get away from the pirate culture of years past, understanding some of these guardrails and laws and structures that are in place that have been voted on. These have been widely accepted, that we want these things so that these people can have protection, so that these employees can have longevity in the roles that they're in and not be used and abused. I think all of that stuff is 2 thumbs up. I just think that's the problem that you sometimes run into when one or more parties doesn't exactly have it understood of what's involved.
It's also a PSA to restaurant owners because, like I said, this is a very common occurrence. And if we end up getting to a point where this lawsuit is won, I would think that again, not a lawyer, but it would set a precedent where you have, at least in California and then elsewhere. So if you're a restaurant, knowing your local labor laws, knowing your regulations to the T, understanding employee breaks. I know a lot of chefs that don't really care about breaks, don't care about meals. It's very important that you have those. And I'll be honest, I would scoff at breaks and needing a break, but I'm not everyone else that works in a kitchen. There's people that need it for physical needs, for mental needs, for just simply just needing a break. And restaurants have not operated. I feel like there's been a thought that you can operate on the boundaries of these things, on these labor laws, because we're a quote unquote pirate ship. But if someone like the French Laundry, who I will agree is very buttoned up, obviously has a very in-depth hospitality program, obviously has been around for a very long time, understands California law, and one of the strictest labor markets in the country. If even they are getting caught up on this, you can bet that many restaurants are, would on paper be doing much worse. So it's PSA to that. And I think, Justin, one thing we talked about is staging. And I feel like me and you are maybe fall a little bit differently on staging. I'm of the mindset that free staging is not something I support beyond maybe if it's an internship role. I think you could even argue that internships from the CIA should require some form of payment due to the impact. But if this is ruled, then staging, I think, is going to, which is technically in most states, not really legal how some restaurants use it. It's going to be scrutinized even more. And I think if we see a ruling in favor of the person suing the French Laundry or the Thomas Keller Group, I think staging could be next. And I don't see that being very far off. Your thoughts?
I needed to go back and look at that 2014 season where all of this stuff was happening. And the specific language that was used in some of these California labor laws. It said the French Laundry moved towards only accepting stagiaires who could receive academic credit through a culinary school. That kind of ties into what you were talking about with externships and your and I's experience in we had to do an externship manual, and that applied towards our credits getting us prepared to graduate and get our degrees. And so all of that being, if you can go down the list and check these boxes, then you can kind of put your thumbs up and say, okay, well, this actually qualifies in order for this to happen. I think where you and I do agree is this idea of, and somebody had posted this, I don't have the exact source, but I've referenced this in the past in my own words, which is if you basically stripped all of the stagiaires away, or the labor department came knocking on the door and said, hey, everybody who's staging right now needs to basically stop what they're doing and, leave the kitchen right now. What happens to the organization? Now, if that organization has individuals taking little things off of people's prep lists just to help, or it's an observational thing where you're measuring recipes out for people just to save time, or there's some cleaning things that are happening, cryovacking projects, those sorts of things, it's not going to completely cripple the restaurant. It might put that team behind for the day. They might not be able to be, quote unquote, as buttoned up or get as much done that day as they previously would have been able to. But then you take another example where it's entire stations are being run by stagiaires. Entire, like big components, talking about an entire dish's main thing is being executed by a team of stagiaires. Or this process, take like a fermentation example, where this component is not going to be available to use by the restaurant if these stagiaires are not here doing this thing. That's a very different way of looking at, this involvement that somebody is having in this organization. And so that's where I kind of not draw the line, but I think that is, you can kind of pressure test whatever environment you're looking at and say, which one is this? Obviously, it's a spectrum. There's ways that we can fall in between some of these things. But yeah, I think the other counterpoint that we certainly saw in the NOMA stuff, and other people might have the same view here when we're talking about staging, free labor, that kind of thing, is the opportunity that it gives somebody to break into the industry, get a foot in the door in the industry when you don't have the resume, the CV, the credentials to send to somebody, and you don't have the funds or the capacity or the ability to go to somewhere like a culinary school. And that's where I also certainly have benefited myself. Like, I'd be lying if I was to say that, like that level, like I went to the university, but when we're talking about a fine dining context, I basically got told that I couldn't get that job in that fine dining restaurant that I wanted to get hired at, even though I had my degree. This was post-graduation. The fine dining chef was basically like, you don't have any of the credentials to work here. I'm sorry. And the same thing happened with other restaurants that I applied at coming out of CIA, because it was hyper competitive. And so the staging was almost this, again, the foot in the door thing from I'm going to give my quote unquote time in the short term in exchange for an employment opportunity in the long term. Not saying that's how it should be. I'm saying that's how it basically worked. But then at the same time, I was gaining skills during those stagiaire experiences so that I was able to be a more valuable person sitting across the table from that chef in an interview, where I can say I can bring these things to the organization because I know how to set up, because I know how to execute tasks, because I know how to move in this environment. And so all of that I significantly benefited from. And that even went on to when I was like a lead line cook at a restaurant, I was still staging at places, because it allowed me to go into some of these experiences and see what they were doing in a way that it wasn't necessarily I needed to, file all the paperwork to get on the, from the HR perspective. It was like, hey, I'm coming in, I'm hanging out, I'm getting some of these insights from what it is that you guys do on the day-to-day. And there's obviously stories of that going maliciously wrong, people stealing recipes, people getting exploited and abused. Caveat, caveat. I just think I, maybe more so than you, Ray, fall on this side of there's stuff to be gained when everybody is in agreement, consenting adults almost in these arrangements. The problem comes when somebody is either unaware of what to expect, unaware of some of the downsides that they're getting taken advantage of. And then it starts to almost snowball, where it started with 2 stagiaires and then it turned into 6 and now it's 13. And now all of a sudden you look up and there's 25 stagiaires doing XYZ thing for the restaurant. That turns into a really negative place.
I
Your
think
thoughts?
it's also a culture play. This isn't as much as staging as it is the idea of having to work off the clock or work when you're not necessarily getting
Yes.
paid. I remember when I left restaurants, went into food manufacturing R&D, I was only expected to work when I'm on the clock. I'm like, I'm only expected to work when I'm in office. My weekends were truly my weekends. My time away was truly my time away. And there's an inherent pressure in a lot of kitchens due to bad, and maybe not even bad sometimes, but intense culture that they don't even realize it. But it's like I felt pressured to come in early, like an hour and 2 hours early to work. Sometimes I felt pressured to clock out and keep going and working and ideating and like going and doing things like that. Pressure, that culture is what needs to change, in my opinion, because there's going to be a lot of blowback, especially now. And like it's just we're in 2026, and to have that pressure where you're expecting your employees to work and they're morally bad within the hierarchy of the kitchen if they don't do that is the difference between okay, I used to go to the market with my chef on Saturdays for the one restaurant I worked for, didn't get paid, didn't need to go, wanted to go because I wanted to pick his brain, and so I'd go to the market, and that was an hour and a half of what you could call maybe labor or going, but that was me going to the market because I wanted to learn, and that was like something it's one of my favorite moments in cooking. I was just gonna say I didn't see that as like a negative and whatnot. I chose to do that. But then there's restaurants where I worked at where it's like you need to come in early tomorrow. You're behind on prep. Don't clock in for an hour. Like no. That's kind of my drawing the line, if I could, for giving examples.
Yeah, speaking of examples, I have two other quick anecdotes to share. One is I worked at the French Laundry before their big, expensive renovation. And so I cannot confirm or deny this. I needed to walk 10 minutes to go to take my rest break point that they make because it was essentially a 15 to call it 30-minute break that all of us would take during staff meal, where, again, depending on what was involved in the staff meal, if you're working lunch, you would work lunch service. We would have a breakfast staff meal that you would typically like eat at your station. And then during the menu meeting, there would be another staff meal. And, like there was all these things that would, depending on the day, it was different where the staff meal would happen. And obviously, depending on how busy you were, that would also turn into something that you're almost touching on, where it's kind of like the amount of time you decide to dedicate to your break based on your workload might change. But that is self-inflicted, right? That is me deciding I'm going to go back on my station and do this thing, rather than my employer saying, you need to stop your break and you need to come back to work to do this thing. That's maybe one important thing to touch on. And then the second idea is after that job, I left the French Laundry. I was kind of getting a little bit burnt out of the 3 Michelin star world, and I went to go work at a butcher shop in Napa. And that was such a different environment because, one, I went from working like 70, 80-hour weeks to working 40 hours a week, it felt like a half day going in and spending that time. I got a dedicated break. But the most jarring thing was I just thought it was normal to do what you and I are kind of talking about, where you go in and you might start setting up a little bit. And it was so clear that a manager would come in and they would have eyes on the employee time log, or they would just know that I would want to kind of sometimes stay after and do some things. And it was very apparent and so starkly different, not from the French Laundry explicitly here, but I'm more talking about restaurant kitchens where the question comes to you and, hey, are you clocked in right now?
Mhm.
Because it is not a fear that the labor department is going to come knocking at the door at any moment, but it is very similar to if you were to see somebody doing XYZ safety sanitation thing as a line cook. You want to ask the question like, hey, how long has that been out for? Or, hey, like, make sure you're wearing gloves when you're doing that. Or, hey, make sure you wash your hands. You know what I mean? If you see somebody come in and they didn't do XYZ thing that is really, really important in the context of the standards that you maybe have in your mind, that was very illuminating for me as an experience. I mean, like, oh, like, you can take this stuff seriously. You can integrate this in. I love that you use the word culture. If you have a culture of people saying, we respect these things, we take these things seriously, and we make sure that we're adhering to these things that we are going to be held accountable to if we don't follow these rules. And anybody who's going to say that there's not rules in any of these things, go down the list of financial stuff you have to be compliant with, sanitation stuff you have to be compliant with, code stuff in the building that you have to be compliant with. And so, again, talking about the intellectually dishonest part of people throwing up their hands and saying, this is just how it is. I'm not discounting the fact that it happens. I'm more saying, what can we push towards? And what can we decide that we're going to want to prioritize? As opposed to looking at this as oh, people are just being weak and trying to squeeze a bunch of money out of the organization. Because I initially saw the amount as $35,000 as like, well, does this even warrant a lawsuit? And to your point, Ray, it's almost like it's not about the money. It's
Mm.
about the desire to actually have this be clean and play by the rules. And if things aren't happening that facilitate that, it's a bigger question on the organization of, well, what's going on here? Okay. I had an interest. Do you have any other thoughts there? Or are we
No, they were good to go.
okay? Next story, Ray. How much do you know about BILT, this company that just launched a new hospitality program? It is not a hospitality company, but when I say the word BILT, are you familiar with them?
Yes, only because I have a friend Cole who's very ingrained in Built. I'll be honest, Justin, I'm not the biggest on credit cards. So I try to avoid them as much as I can, but I do know Built has some good perks from what I've heard. I've also heard they've launched something new. But yes, I'm aware of Built in a tertiary sense. So
Well, I was not expecting to see this video pop up on my feed where the person promoting the video is BILT. And the people who are highlighted in the first few seconds of the video is Thomas Keller, great transition from this French Laundry story, Daniel Boulud, we have Will Gadara, and Danny Meyer. So, like, these are titans of the industry. What is BILT Hospitality and why does it matter? So, I want to spend some time on this because I think this feeds into predictions that you and I have made on the show. I think this is genuinely a competitor to some of these other companies in the space that are trying to vie for this kind of role. And I'm just fascinated by the way that they're deciding to build this and launch this. So I want to give some background because BILT is not originally a hospitality company. They have had a long road and roadmap of building towards this. And so I want to give some background. This has been kind of a slow burn. 2019 BILT launches, and its core product was this idea, not hospitality related again, that, hey, consumers have the ability to put things like groceries and travel and their Netflix bill on a credit card and earn points to build credit from that spend. You get these double benefits. Obviously, there's interest that is associated with credit cards. People can rack up a bunch of debt, and there's downsides to all of this. But this company was basically saying, why can't we put our rent on a credit card to get those two specific benefits, earn points and build your credit, which is anywhere from, the company was citing, 30 to 50% of folks' income. And why can't rent do the same? Obviously, there's implications of, well, people are just going to not have the money to pay their rent and they're just going to rack up all this stuff. Obviously, that's understood. But I think they had some really thoughtful ways that they would set limits on things, have you provide proof of funds. And so there's some really creative ways that I'm going to get into how they were allowing some of their customers to get points, even with landlords who wouldn't accept credit cards for their rent. And that's obviously one of the reasons why landlords historically do not accept credit cards, because they don't want people to rack up this bill that they don't actually have the ability to pay. It goes to collections, someone declares bankruptcy, all those things. And so that initially started in 2019. In 2021, they launched this card. So they say it's the BILT MasterCard. It's partnered with Wells Fargo, and you can put your rent on a credit card. I'm not going to say for the first time because I can imagine there's other examples where people were able to skirt around this. But the big revolutionary thing that they were like really started to gain traction on was you could do this, you could earn points, there was no transaction fees. And so they're savvy. They're acknowledging that some of these landlords don't take credit cards. And so what they would literally do is skirt around this by allowing customers to pay BILT through the app, build that credit, earn those points, and then BILT would send your landlord a physical check. Wild how they were able to, this goes like super scrappy startup type of behavior. And so they've got a history. What I was kind of taking away from this is really aiming to over deliver on the customer experience side. What can we do to like maybe buck the status quo, the current way that people are thinking, or the boxes that exist, and say, what would be a 11 out of 10 customer experience? I've shared that exercise in the past that people can do, and they can look that up, even if the infrastructure isn't quite there yet. And we can, again, talk in the comments about some of the negatives of people getting exploited by credit card companies. That has also been in the news lately. But with anything that is too good to be true, sometimes it is. And this was an example of one of those things being the case with the way they structured the economics for this card. And so at the risk of going too far into credit card land, Ray, I know that we have had some clips go viral, reasonably viral for us when we do credit card related content. I don't know why. Maybe that's just a section of the internet that is starved for content or likes to get into the comment section and argue. But there needs to be a way to sustain this type of business model. Otherwise, the economics of it all ends up breaking. And that's basically what happened with BILT, where they weren't making any money. Their bank partner in Wells Fargo wasn't making money off of all these people bringing their rent and getting points off of this stuff. And then the Wells Fargo had to pay out those points. And so there was no way to bring in revenue, which kind of ties into, weirdly, some of the stories that you and I have been talking about on the show, Ray, where it's like, oh my goodness, this organization is losing tons and tons of money or not having the revenue match whatever their overhead and expenses are. And so they went back to the drawing board, and the TLDR is that they now have 3 tiers of cards that BILT does that are annual fees associated cards. And you have to now spend a certain amount of non-rent stuff to get the availability to earn points on paying your rent. And so what all of this stuff, and the reason I give that backstory, did for BILT and sets them up to have Thomas Keller and Daniel Boulud and Danny Meyer and Will Gadar in their launch video, is that they have a customer base of 5 million people now because they were able to, grow this and offer that value to those people who sign up for this thing. And that's where this new offer comes in. So enter BILT Hospitality. And so this is BILT's program that provides restaurants with tools for what they're calling concierge-powered reservations. The operators also have access to things like guest history on arrival, and then they also have integrated payments, which I'm going to talk about, and I want to dive into each of these individually. And so I need to caveat that I have not experienced this tech on the guest side, and I also have not experienced this on the operator side. I don't know what the dashboard or it looks like a AI agent almost. You can message this thing, or I can assume there's dashboards that you have access to, but they are spending a lot on these partnerships, and they have these people locked in, these big restaurant groups locked in, and there's some big names associated with this. So I think this is kind of worth touching on. So let's start with these concierge-powered reservations is what they're calling it. So again, if you want to listen to my predictions episode, I talked about this in December, Ray, if I'm not mistaken, when we made that episode, that restaurant tech was going to make some really big strides in 2026, and that certainly seems to be happening. So I referenced the fact that the current experience of making a reservation in the age of the open tables and the Rezzies and the Talks of the world was not that far off from, I don't know if you want to call it like a glorified calendar booking software meets filling out a form. Those are the basically 2 things that you do when you make a reservation for a restaurant in 2025. Not a lot of hospitality there. And so the idea here with BILT Hospitality, and I'm pulling from the launch video here, and we're going to link the launch video for the show notes in the show notes for folks. We do that for all the stories that we cover here on the podcast if you are new to the show, is that you will have the ability to chat in what looks like an AI agent type of setup. So it's like a chatbot. And they give these examples in the launch video where it says, hey, quote, "Hey, BILT, send Marco some complimentary drinks and a welcome note from me." And this is an example. It's Daniel Boulud. He's sitting at the table in the dining room of the restaurant doing this, basically sending off that message. And oh my goodness, and the behind the scenes magic, I'm sure that just gets delegated as a task to somebody in the BILT software, or it automatically fires off a, ticket in the bar that had, you know what I mean? How this actually nuts and bolts ends up working, I have no idea. But other examples that give us kind of a hint into what they're thinking about is flagging allergies. So XYZ person has a shellfish allergy. One of the people, they didn't mention this in the tech side of things, but one of the people that they had speaking who was onboarded to the platform said, "We have a guest that particularly likes to sit towards the window for their table. How do you operationalize that and decide that XYZ specific request is going to be adhered to?" And then other little steps of service that people might be familiar with. For example, "Please take care of him as a VIP and help him with a reservation tonight," is an example that they gave in the launch video. And the second data piece, and they're calling this guest history, but essentially, since BILT has this network of, they're calling it 20,000 restaurants, and they also have this is getting into like multi-level marketing territory when I was researching the show. They have something called the BILT Alliance, and it's a network of real estate properties where they were basically saying, hey, we're trying to get all these landlords and buildings and real estate companies to convince them that we can have their tenants pay rent through our platform and earn points. What if we just partnered with the real estate properties? And so they just went direct. So the place that you live can be directly integrated with BILT. And so your rent is paid in that way, and you get perks for just living in that type of building. Folks who are taking advantage of or living in a place like that, you can tell us how it's going for you and if it's maybe worth it, not worth it. But they also And this is an important caveat for how they're able to build this stuff out and the stuff that might have been missing for the restaurant tech being quote unquote good enough as being able to provide value in the market. BILT also acquired a company called Banyan. For those that aren't familiar with that company, it was a infrastructure product designed to give you item level receipt data for the purchases that you're making. And so if you're using your BILT card throughout your week, throughout your month, throughout your year, it knows a ton about how you spend. And that is also really interesting in the way that they're talking about integrated payments with BILT Hospitality. So this leads me into that last point on the payment side, which has been a controversial topic, I'm going to call it, Ray. When we're talking about platforms like Blackbird or any of these companies where you basically don't have to request to pay. And you don't have to request for the check. You don't have to wait for it. You don't have to pull out your card. You don't have to have the person run your card and then you have to fill out the receipt. If I'm not mistaken, what they're aiming to do with BILT Hospitality with these integrated payments is do what Uber did to the transaction experience inside of a cab, where it's you just get out of the car. It's already sorted. Based on the behind the scenes tech infrastructure that we have, we know who you are. We have your card on file. We know what you purchased. You can just get up and leave. And really quick, the reason that I've seen this shared and the reason that it is controversial for those that aren't familiar with why is that if you remove that dropping the check part of the step of service, it causes some ripple effects for the customer experience. Because historically, that was the time to say goodbye to the table, to invite them back, to gather feedback on how was everything, to give something extra as a bonus. There's a bunch of consumer psychology here with, I'm almost positive it's the Italian restaurant that gives the chocolate mint at the end of the experience. It is, tips are higher for servers, all of this stuff from an economics perspective, you see that play out. And if you just remove that entirely, you just tell the whole table you can just get up and leave. How, people were upset because there's like a void there. And then operators were upset because you would take care of this table through their entire experience and then you would basically not be able to say goodbye. And when you lose that, what BILT did in the demo was give an interesting and I would argue compelling way to almost flip this and show an example of they send this message going to a guest that had just had an experience at the restaurant. And it says, quote, "Thanks for dining with us. Enjoy a complimentary Lyft ride," end quote. And so then they also include examples like you're a restaurant group and you have your main restaurant, but you also have a place across the street that's like a small cocktail bar. You have the ability through this BILT Hospitality app to send that person, please invite them to have a nightcap that actually increases the quote unquote check average if you're looking at that, or if you want to calculate it in lifetime value, depending on how your business does it. I guess that's what I'm a fan of, is not this idea that, oh, we're just going to remove that whole step and now it's just going to feel empty and it's going to be this weird void. I think there's an opportunity here to do more for the guest and provide more value to them if the tools can get good enough to kind of do so. So that's the big launch. I'm going to share a couple of my thoughts and then I'm curious to hear what you think on some of this stuff, Ray. You can go on the dining.bilt.com website right now and book a demo if you're an operator and you kind of want to kick the tires and see how this works, have somebody from BILT show you around. I'm going to go rapid fire here. The first thought that I had is we might actually have more of an opportunity to achieve what I shared when we were going over, Ray, these black market reservations that were kind of cropping up where people were sniping these online reservations, then they were selling them at a markup. Some solution that might be plausible to help with this problem is something like BILT Hospitality, where you can't have this like massive swarm of anonymous accounts on BILT that has purchase history, because you can't realistically do that without it being exorbitantly expensive, right? So if you're going to try to, have a bot farm that's going to scan these restaurant reservation websites and snipe them, it's really difficult to do so. And then the other one is, if you're somebody who is a regular, you spend a lot, you go out to eat a lot, you're the couple who dines around New York City a lot, but you're in Miami for the weekend, the ability to message that restaurant in Miami and through BILT and say, hey, do you have any availability on Friday night? That's the hospitality experience that I was kind of craving or maybe trying to go for or express in December when I made that prediction, that I want to see a resurgence of, as opposed to these like largely artificial experiences or maybe zero hospitality at all on the website. And because of this data backend now, the operator can make that call and shift things around, as opposed to, and like almost verify that every single person in the dining room tonight is real, as opposed to what you and I have seen with these no-call, no-shows that just totally hemorrhage a restaurant's ability to kind of be profitable. I'm also really curious to see in a competitive landscape how some of these other platforms that we've been covering, Seven Rooms, for example, Loyalist is another one from Maggie, friend of the show, Blackbird, and even larger players who kind of dabble in reservations but haven't launched their own official product. Google is the one that I'm thinking of. How are they going to compete with something like this? I'm curious your thoughts.
I think what is most interesting to me, like you said, is like the data, the nuanced data, deeper hospitality. I've seen a lot of anecdotal complaints from people not in the food industry, customers, you would say, where they feel like hospitality is lacking in the modern age, where it's not fully there. What I think this allows, what I'm always a fan of, are tools that give staff better insights on how to be more hospitable to their guests. I think the restaurants that are going to win are going to use data. They're going to use preferences, going to use what people in the built ecosystem have to really layer and level experiences that are unforgettable based on that information. And so then what you could see with Built is you could see them becoming a necessity in the restaurant space because where else do you get data like that? Because all this information is built into, quote, no pun intended, built into this platform that then restaurateurs can really use and leverage based on everything they've received. So I think that hospitality aspect is a really smart play. I think it's really smart to go after, like you said, industry titans to have this network and ecosystem of chefs, leaders in that realm. And yeah, I wonder. I mean, where these things kind of fall apart for me is like you said that when you start to have a bunch of competitors, and then like you have to have Built for the French Laundry, but then you have to have another. So like it's interesting to see where the integration is going to go and which one's going to come out on top. But Built obviously has a head start in some aspects.
Yeah, the biggest thing for me is just what is going to happen when the asks from the guest almost not fall on deaf ears, but it becomes, you don't have somebody like a Will Gadara unreasonable hospitality culture in the restaurant to keep up with the number of requests that the guests are sending through. That's just something that comes to mind if you really open that Pandora's box and say, you can ask for anything and we'll do it for you. I think you and I maybe align on this idea of you're asking almost too much of the team in that situation where you have these one-off super custom, I want XY, I want the VIP experience, and if I don't get it, who does that reflect poorly on? Right? Does it reflect poorly on the guest for seeming entitled and asking for things that, maybe aren't available or aren't feasible? Is it reflect poorly on the restaurant because they don't have the staffing or the steps of service or whatever? Or does it reflect poorly on BILT Hospitality because they are over-promising if they're going to onboard a bunch of guests and say, if you become a user with us, you can go to any restaurant that you want and ask for these amazing experiences. And are they actually able to deliver on it? I don't know. It's just a very interesting thing that came to mind in the way that they phrased the launch video, because it's almost this funny thing where if everybody's a VIP, then nobody's a VIP. It's almost like there's no differentiation there. And the differentiation is what makes it, quote unquote, feel special. I'm not necessarily saying that anybody should or should not have a VIP program. Don't get that twisted. It's more it's that point. The differentiation is what makes it feel special. And that being available, quote unquote, on tap via a chatbot message, I don't know the implications of that. And we have yet to see how that's going to necessarily play out. And so that was the closing thought number one. Closing thought number two, I texted this to you, Ray, and I'll just share this with the audience before we move on because I'm kind of curious if anybody has a story in the comments that they want to share with us here. DoorDash is getting into reservations and actually taking market share away from platforms like Resy. And so I texted this to you. I received 3 emails last week from restaurants basically giving me the heads up that they are switching from Resy to DoorDash exclusively for that restaurant. Reservations are not going to be available on any other platform. If you want a reservation here, you have to go to DoorDash. And one of these 3 places was a 1 Michelin starred place. So this is not just, mom and pop places. This is, places who have probably long-standing commitments with Resy. There's a lot of lock-in that you get when you decide that you're going to go with one of these companies. And I'm very curious to see what those deals look like behind the scenes. If DoorDash is paying people to switch, they've done that in the past. How they're getting exclusivity with some of these restaurants. Because the wording of the email was very like, we are exclusively here now. And I'm also curious to hear from a value perspective, as we're talking about data and the amount of data that a platform like DoorDash has, the guests that are coming in, the back end infrastructure and operations that are available to restaurants, and then some of these add-on things that will be available if you get into the DoorDash world. I'm sure you also maybe saw, Ray, this idea that DoorDash was having AI hire humans. Maybe we can link that in the show notes. It was this idea that DoorDash had the ability to do like almost bounty level tasks, like if you've ever done TaskRabbit before.
Yeah.
But it was like AI is making those requests to people on the DoorDash app to do tasks that the computers cannot do out in the real world. And so all of this is accelerating and moving faster, and everybody's trying to compete, which is very, very interesting. And that's just one more reservation related tangent that I wanted to go on. What else you got?
Yeah. I want to go do Sysco?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. So a big story. So what happened? Sysco is buying Restaurant Depot. This is interesting to me for a variety of reasons. There's this worry of Sysco having too much power. If you're not aware of Sysco, they are basically a food service company. They are very well known. If you've seen any, TikToks or Instagram reels, Sysco supplies a lot of food to different restaurants. And what is interesting about this is people over time have started to kind of make fun of this idea that everything is just Sysco reformed or reshaped. And Sysco is seen in the restaurant industry as kind of a negative. It's seen as something where if you're using Sysco, you're taking the easy way out. It offers convenience. It offers a lot of different items. They're a supplier that is just very, very integral to a lot of food businesses. And Justin and I have talked on the show how like sometimes Sysco is necessary. Sometimes they're necessary for certain sourcing or pricing or getting different basically items. So what happened this last week though is Sysco is buying Restaurant Depot for $29 billion. So, quote, small independents want to use Jetro Restaurant Depot to keep the prices of the Syscos of the world honest. Now that pressure valve belongs to Sysco itself, raising urgent questions about pricing power, supply chains, and whether one more point on food costs will squeeze what's left of mom and pop restaurant margins. Sysco's moved to buy Jetro Restaurant Depot for $29.1 billion is a structural shift, reordering how the 250,000 independent restaurant sources its food, provided regulators that let the deal stand as proposed. This deal will reshape how those operators buy everything from chicken wings to to-go containers for the next decade. And so I had an article here that I thought was very interesting. This was from the website was Restaurant Business Online. Quote, the Independent Restaurant Coalition is calling on the U.S. Federal Trade Commission to block Sysco's proposed acquisition of Restaurant Depot, saying that the deal would eliminate a crucial alternative used by many local operators. In a statement Monday, the coalition cited Sysco's comments on the deal, saying that it would create an, quote, omni-channel partner for the entire food service industry. The Independent Restaurant Coalition believes the FTC must scrutinize that ambition for exactly what it is, the elimination of Restaurant Depot, the one meaningful wholesale alternative in many regions that independent restaurants have used for decades to avoid the minimum order requirements, delivery fees, and pricing power of the nation's largest food distributor, Sysco. Another important point, Justin, Sysco often has minimum orders, requirements, delivery fees, and so what happens is a lot of smaller independent restaurants can either get priced out or incur a lot of costs due to the fact that Sysco requires these. The IRC was formed in the pandemic, and Sysco surprised much of the restaurant world when they made this purchase. The deal was largely panned on Wall Street amid fears that the distributor would amass too much debt in the acquisition, and it also generated fears among local restaurants worried about the impact on the prices and food quality they'll get at Restaurant Depot. Sysco is the largest broadline distributor of food and other goods to food service companies around the country, and Restaurant Depot is the largest provider of so-called cash and carry distribution in the food service sector. The company operates 166 warehouses in metro areas, giving some 725,000, mostly small local restaurant operators, a source of food, paper, and other goods. So Restaurant Depot is a place where maybe your Sysco delivery didn't come, maybe you weren't able to get a delivery from another vendor. You could walk into Restaurant Depot, get items often cheaper than Sysco. There's the luxury of being able to go there. I've worked at many restaurants where someone was sent to Restaurant Depot to get these items. For decades, Restaurant Depot has been the great equalizer for independent restaurants, the place where a small operator could walk in and get the same price as everyone else, no contract, no negotiation, no leverage required. Sysco's acquisition of Restaurant Depot doesn't just limit competition, it changes the playing field entirely in Sysco's favor. And They go on to say too that it does have substantial competitors in the broadline market, including U.S. Foods, and U.S. Foods has its own cash and carry operation called Chef Store, so they could be basically a defense they have. But then the final thing from IRC is that when deliveries fall short, when prices spike, when margins get tight, many independent restaurants and bars have had a fallback, Restaurant Depot. Sysco's plan to acquire it puts that lifeline at risk. We're calling on the FTC to block this merger because independent businesses deserve real choice, not fewer options. Join us and call your member of Congress today, which I will leave in the link below. Justin, your thoughts?
I'm not a lawyer, and I honestly am not going to be the one to either call yay or nay on these things, because quite honestly, when you get to these numbers and these scales, it gets murky because, as you kind of mentioned, you can't say that there's no other competitors, because there are, and it's almost like you have this polyopoly, I think is the word that some people will call it, where it's not there's not 15 participants in the market, there's 5, and then it goes from 5 to 4. Is that calling it a monopoly? I think you and I do agree that Sysco is the biggest player. They do have this habit of making some of these acquisitions with anybody who's going to, quote unquote, not threaten or be a competitor. I think they are just being strategic and thinking about, okay, well, clearly they're paying for something for $29 billion. You know what I mean? It's not a case of, well, we're just going to do it so that it eliminates the competition. The physical real estate that they take up, the supply chain infrastructure that they have, it might even be similar enough to Sysco where it's a seamless integration and it's not that big of a deal. I also am not the type of person who ran a business that solely relied on any of these companies. And so I maybe don't have enough experience to speak on it with enough context where, oh my goodness, my business was totally eaten up or gobbled up, or I was not able to do my business in a profitable way because I was super reliant on Sysco because I was in a certain geographical area where that was my only option. And then Sysco raised their prices and I wasn't able to do anything about it. That is not something I've experienced. And so I don't want to speak on it out of turn, maybe. But I am more interested in covering it here on the show because I know that I've certainly gone to Chef Store to get stuff. I've ordered stuff from Sysco for research projects for clients where they're trying to do a nationwide launch, and it's something where they need to prioritize sourcing from Sysco. And so I kind of have maybe enough experience there, but it is something where it gets really murky when we're talking about the FTC getting involved and some of these lawsuits. It also seems like the person who owns Restaurant Depot also wanted this to go through. Obviously, $29 billion is a big check. And so I guess that's also where my head is. And I'm trying to keep you folks informed with some, like, in line with a lot of the other stories that we cover here. I don't know if
Yeah,
you
I
have
think
other thoughts.
yeah, for me, I've used Cisco, and I've used it in the sense too where I've had a contractual obligation to use them.
Right.
And so I do think the worry is the business practices of, like, I had a setup once where we were contracted out in Cisco as a group, so I can only have a percentage of other items coming from this other distributor, but that distributor had better prices. But because I was contractually obligated to use Cisco, I couldn't actually seek out the better price because of the contract, even though they weren't giving me the better price.
Yep.
The other producer was. I'll also say that there's often order minimums. That's money minimums or it's case minimums. For example, a small restaurant might only need like 10 to 12 items. Sometimes Cisco will have a 15 to 20 minimum for cases you need to order. And so it's this anti-competitive practice that I think worries a lot of people with the contractual obligations, some of which are really dirty and really like not great for restaurants, some of which are the minimums on cases. And the worry that, you know, it makes them more money to keep having a flow of, minimums, contracts, and all that. Restaurant Depot, I've experienced having to go there many times for many different restaurants. It is often cheaper. It's often quicker. For chefs that have a smaller business, private chef wise, it's a lot easier. Private chefs really can't get into Cisco. I do understand the worry and the fear that this huge conglomerate is just eating up another portion. And what it really is it could, and it's this state now, it isn't, but it could really diminish the buying power for small restaurants. And I think it's another thing that's hitting independent restaurants. I covered credit card fees on my solo episode, Justin. I think many people were surprised. It was some figure that like it costs families $1,200 a year just based on the credit card fee raises fee price increases that have happened over the last like year. And so like it's all these pressures on independents that are getting really, really tough. And so I think that's the worry. And I personally think there needs to be at least regulation on this because it is such a huge part of it. I don't necessarily know that they shouldn't be. I don't think they need to be combined. I think that if Cisco is going to come in and keep the practices that they have now with their contracts, I am very worried. If there's regulation that they can't do that and there's just different ownership, not as bad. But I have experienced it where it hasn't made sense and it actually hasn't been a financial win for us, but it has been a financial win for Cisco. And like that's obviously never going to be a good outcome. I don't know if you have any more on that or if we want to touch on McCormick real quick.
Yeah, we both have some quick hits. I guess I'm curious to kind of touch on your example that might hit home with somebody who's listening here. The private chef who goes into a restaurant depot to just shop in person. Myself, I have a client thing tomorrow, and I'm going to start prep, and I just need to go here and source some of my stuff myself. Were you able to gather, and maybe I missed this, are they going to basically keep those as like kind of their cash and carry representations
That's
for Cisco? Or is it
that's
something
what
where
we
they're
don't know.
saying, yeah, 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 that's maybe a little confusing for me.
And that's what I'm saying. Like if they keep it as is, you know, there's the people that you can be upset about Cisco, but there's no harm, no foul. Like you keep having that. But if they start to maybe try to get away from that or reduce that option, or even just simply raise their prices, it's going to be very difficult for people. And like I think how I read it that is there would be like a short term maybe relief in prices, but over time they'll eventually be able to roll in their own pricing structure, and like that's not going to be okay for independents. It's just going to be way more expensive.
Sure.
Um, One more quick hit, and then we'll do yours, and we'll be out of here.
Yep.
Unilever is combining McCormick. So this is from Food Dive. So Unilever's food segment is valued at roughly double the size of McCormick's entire business. And the combination is an ambitious play to create a global condiments and seasonings company with a stable of well-known brand names. Unilever shareholders will receive 55.1% of combined company equity, and the CPG giant will retain 9.9% stake, which will be sold down over time of McCormick. McCormick will maintain its global headquarters in Hunt Valley, Maryland, and create a secondary listing in Europe. It will also establish an international headquarters in the Netherlands, where Unilever has a long-standing presence. This transaction marks Unilever's retreat from the food business, allowing the company to focus on the more profitable personal goods sector. Last year, Unilever spun off its ice cream business into the Magnum Ice Cream Company, which owns Talenti, Klondike, and Ben& Jerry's. McCormick has identified M&A as a key opportunity to grow beyond its iconic red and white spice jars and enter in fast-growing flavor and seasoning categories such as hot sauce, mustard, and more. The company purchased Frank's Red Hot Sauce and French's Mustard as part of a $4.2 billion deal for Reckitt Benckiser's food business in 2017. McCormick was able to reinvest in French's and other acquired brands to create meaningful growth, a strategy it intends to follow with Unilever's food business. And the transaction with Unilever is the largest deal in McCormick's history. Quote, we see a tremendous opportunity across our combined portfolio to take high growth potential brands like Cholula hot sauces and Mael mustard and accelerate growth and innovation. And so this is a bigger picture for me. It's like you're not necessarily owning like Cisco owns the structure of how people are getting food and whatnot. This is more so a monopoly on flavor for a big company like this. And again, I don't know that I have necessarily a negative reaction, but it is concerning. All these like whether it's food production, whether it's flavor, these everything's being like kind of brought under one umbrella, and I do think that is concerning. But it is important news. It's definitely not as quote unquote spicy as the Cisco news, but I do think it's important to understand like these flavor companies being bought, merged together, brought together, and I don't know your thoughts. I personally am just like this they'll have a lot of jobs in Maryland. This will be a great opportunity. I think the governor of Maryland shared Wes Moore that this was a great opportunity for Maryland to have this. At the same time, it keeps this amalgamation going of food companies. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on this, but it was just interesting to me.
I don't know if I buy the monopoly on flavor idea or this line because it's the counter narrative in my mind is these mergers and these acquisitions that are happening are also counter trended by these smaller CPG brands that we cover on the show too. We try to cover both sides here, but also this idea that those companies are often preferred to or have more loyalty than some of these larger companies that our parents used in a lot of ways. And so that's maybe the only not saving grace for something like this, but I think you see some of these things in these larger companies like McCormick get so watered down because they have to be like represented across the entire nation, or they have to vie for
For the
shelf
world.
space. Yeah, and they need to almost go to the lowest common denominator and almost lose their identity. They become a commodity, so to speak. And then that creates the perfect landscape for a young, new, desire to make a statement and have an identity competitor to come in and compete in the market. And I think that that is really, really positive. I think a lot of these deals are maybe not maliciously deciding that we're, again, even this idea that really comes, monopolizing flavor makes me almost think of this idea that you can almost like own a dish idea that I think we've covered on the show in the
Yes.
past. And I know that you're maybe not directly using the, monopoly on flavor idea, but
Mm.
it's almost this take that, oh, well, everything is going to be bland and boring or, super expensive because these companies decided to come in together. I don't necessarily buy that. I would more say that it makes it so that the infrastructure for some of these companies or the way that they operate can be a little bit. I know that the piece calls out things like consistency. I think that's like 2 thumbs up. I think less recalls, more safety. Sometimes these things can lead to cheaper things over time because these companies are able to not have so much overhead or combine forces or make their systems a little bit better. And so it's not always bad. I just, the reason that I want us to continue talking about some of this stuff is because you and I get DMs from chefs sometimes, or at least I do, of people saying, "Hey, I worked in XYZ restaurant and I'm thinking about launching my own CPG brand." We have a friend in our group that we kind of meet up with where this person is launching a company that is spices related, and this is
Mhm.
important news for that person because
Yeah.
it turns into something where you should be aware of some of these broader industry contexts. I don't know if you had any other thoughts on this
Yeah,
merger.
I mean, no, I mean, and again, and I don't see it as all negative. McCormick would be a great, cool, be a very cool place to work if you were a research development chef, food scientist. And I think it's also like, I've worked in that Maryland region. McCormick's a huge presence there, and it's like they're a very cool company. And it's maybe not a negative in that sense. It's just more so always being mindful of like things being bought, and also from a customer perspective, like, do most people know that when they buy Cholula that it's owned by a giant company? You know what I mean? Like, and exactly, like, they might think, "Oh, the Cholula company," but no, it's actually owned by it. Like, they're all, like, under this one thing. I covered Rouse, how Campbell's, acquired Rouse. That was a CBG brand. That brand is doing insane right now. Huel was just acquired by Danone. Huel is a meal solutions and, like, protein powder company based in the UK that just got acquired. And so, like, and this is why I'm so passionate about food manufacturing is there is the ability to create companies and almost have this actually exit strategy. I worked for Freshly for a while. That founder, he made Freshly, he sold to Nestle, now he's on to his next venture. It's like there's a whole it's a whole different realm. But just being aware and understanding the realm of that we're living in, and just like understanding that, like, yes, restaurant work is this one thing, but there's so much broader out there when it comes to food that you can be a part of too. But just sharing it because it's important to understand. So
I like you sharing that story because I have often talked about the idea that your restaurant will probably not get acquired. And there's not going to be a liquidity event for you as an entrepreneur who's going to own a restaurant. Obviously, it happens, but I think as we're talking about some of these other companies, if you want to build a business as you're going and crossing that chasm, going from cook to chef to entrepreneur that I've covered ad nauseum before, deciding what type of business you want to have is a really useful starting point. And hearing some of these stories and how you sharing that story of people you've worked with, and then exactly the path that these people take, it doesn't end up being this thing that is like greedy capitalist corporation gobbles up the competitor and then everything is this gray barren place. Obviously there's degradings that we'll see in products and downsizes and disappointing results that people will experience, but oftentimes it is what you outlined. Someone builds something really cool, it gets acquired, that gives that person the funds or the opportunities or the connections or the skill sets to go on and do something else that's really, really cool. And then the market ends up and consumers end up winning more so than any single corporation or monopoly. And so maybe that's where my head goes in this. If it wasn't going to continue to flywheel and benefit into the future, the whole thing would break and we wouldn't have, anything to build on fertile ground wise. And so that's also where my head goes as we're talking about some of this stuff. Okay, last quick hit story that came across my feed that I just wanted to share with you as the line cook thoughts person here on this podcast. there's a company called Line Cook that just launched or came out of, stealth and launched their beta program. What's so interesting about this is they have the @LineCook handle on X, and they also have the linecook.com domain name. And
Almost
so
had to sue them. Line Cook thoughts, Line Cook. They were flying close to the sun there.
yeah,
It's crazy.
There's infringement happening. And so Line Cook is calling themselves an AI powered social app for close friends to share their cooking. And so the two founders, Nick Stewart and Nick Kafker, they literally sold an app to Strava. And so they're calling this the Strava for cooking. So anybody who isn't familiar with Strava, it's this running and fitness app where you can go on a run. You ran 3 miles. You have the ability to socially post on this. It's like a feed, almost like a Facebook feed. And then you can show people where you ran. You can show your numbers, how fast your mile time was. You can compete with other people inside the Strava app. And so if you are like super into running and I think they do cycling too in the Strava app, you have the ability to make it a social thing rather than this thing that is, this is exercise that I do in isolation. And so I'll read a little bit about their announcement that they did when they're going out of stealth and into beta. And then I want to talk about some of the implications and maybe opportunities that might be available for people who want to go onto this app and create or partner or whatever. So this says, quote, "For years, we've been the guys spamming group chats with pics of our latest home cooking experiments. Burnt edges, perfect sauces, glorious disasters, and the rare meal that feels straight out of a Michelin kitchen. But we kept asking ourselves, why don't we have a real home for this hobby? Bookworms have Goodreads." Think, Ray, you maybe use Goodreads. I think there's other apps you've talked about that you enjoy sharing your book, getting book recommendations from and sharing what you're reading and socially connecting with other people. Then this says runners have Strava. Chess nerds have chess.com. Cooks, we've got blurry iMessage threads and disappearing Instagram stories, question mark. So we built Line Cook. It's Strava for home cooking. A place to, and then it says, track your cooking memories and milestones, save every recipe you've nailed, bombed, or want to try one day, and celebrate every meal you make with your own 2 hands, end quote. And if I'm being honest, I've seen other apps try this. There's been a bunch of recipe sharing stuff, but it is like an inherently lonely experience to, you're not going to invite every single friend over to every single meal that you're going to make, and putting on a dinner party can be its own ordeal. And so I was very kind of curious to see this get launched. They have kind of been around for a while or friends for a while, and they're launching this thing, and you can currently join the beta on linecook.com. And what I was mostly wanting to talk about in this show is the opportunity for new platforms for people who are really getting into, I think we've seen this kind of step away from, I am a chef on social media, to I have friends who are creating content who have just fully embraced this idea that I cook at home. This is not building towards a restaurant. This is not trying to launch my quote unquote brand. I'm not trying to compete on America's Culinary Cup that we covered on the show a couple months back. I'm not trying to do consulting gigs as a chef. I am purely a home cook who likes to share stuff. And an app like this, I'm very curious how this will end up playing out if it ends up being almost like an invite-only thing like Strava, where you only kind of like connect with your friends, and that's the app. Or if this turns into something where you can actually quote-unquote make a name for yourself on a platform like Line Cook because you are over-delivering to the community that exists online. And that we have seen play out multiple times as any of these platforms become large. If you can be early, if you can give more than you take, if you can basically establish a presence and provide value, there's often a lot of really good real estate, quote-unquote, for the taking if you have the ability to be a good participant as some of these things launch. I will say that I was a little bit taken aback by like the name and the way that they're kind of going about this, because to me there's a little bit of like a disconnect here where you're talking about Line Cook, but this is like not about restaurants at all. It's not about cooking on the line. It's not about I actually paused myself and I was like, Online Cook was such a no-brainer name for them to take for this, because it is such a funny play on words. It is actually what's happening here. I'm cooking online. And I don't think I've seen anybody. I need to check that domain name and see if that's maybe available. Do you have thoughts on linecook.com and what they're building?
When I was single and I used to just like cook it myself, I remember like having this idea that, why would I even, it's cooking for myself, but I have no one to cook for. So like I would sometimes just not make recipes. And I think it's kind of cool in a sense that, this exists. Maybe this gets people just to make recipes, even if they're by themselves. I know a lot of people are like lonely and, want to cook, and like this could just be a great reason for them to do that and get more into cooking. So I actually really think it's a smart play. It's also like, I built a community around people sharing how they cook, why they cook. Like, it's pretty cool. So, I wonder. I know it works because not since like I had the idea of the app, but the spilling this idea of people sharing what they cook, like it's cool, and I really would love to see like the reason why behind it. So I will definitely be a user when it launches.
This is wild. I just searched that as out of my own curiosity. Onlinecook.com is a, I'm sorry to say this, a direct competitor to linecook.com. So this says save, discover, and cook better recipes together. Save and import recipes from anywhere, show off what you cook, and get inspired by what friends and creators are making. And so I think that's maybe the only saving grace for a linecook.com company as opposed to onlinecook.com is
Hmm.
that it seems like Linecook is just trying to keep it social, as in privately social, like just you and your friends. So it's just the group chat, but instead of exactly what they're talking about, blurry iPhone messages and disappearing Instagram stories, this is something where we can have like a documented recollection on what we cooked together, and maybe that's the thing that will the killer feature that is actually staying small and keeping things simple and not so expansive.
Yeah.
But that's just what I wanted to share in the context of what we talk about here on the Repertoire Report and the Repertoire podcast overall is stuff to help you increase your performance and be a better hospitality professional. And so if any of that sounds interesting, if you enjoyed the show, the stories that we covered, and you want more content just like this, there's a couple ways that you can help. So the first one that is just a little bit of a no-brainer is to like the video if you're on YouTube. We publish these episodes on YouTube if you're listening on a podcast platform. If you're on a podcast platform, you can leave a rating for us. That is super helpful to, it's just a number that Ray and I track for fun because it's cool to see that number go up. It's not the same as some of these other platforms where they have much more analytics that they throw at us publishers. But the ratings is a cool thing that helps us certainly to get into the feeds of more people who are interested in this type of content. And then if you're on YouTube, subscribing and also checking out some of the show notes and the other links that we share with programs that Repertoire shares, the newsletter that we put out, and other tools that we put out there so that you can increase your performance at work. Subscribing to the channel, I talked about leaving the reviews, Ray, sharing with a friend. I think that's the other no-brainer that I think, Ray, you and I send each other books and podcasts all the time. And so if you have somebody else in your world who would get value from nerding out on stuff like this, because we obviously have the ability to do it for over an hour here, it's just
Yeah.
a quick ask from us. We will see you folks next week, and thanks so much for listening.